Today we're going to start our quest into the land of post-flop poker. As we should always do with poker, we will go slow, take it one step at a time, and learn the reasons why we are doing what we're doing and not simply which action to take. As a side, if you can justify why you are doing something, it's probably an okay play. Sound reasoning can make for crazy plays that are correct, even though to amateurs they may look like donkey moves. Anyway, today we will cover how to play the flop and how to maximize the benefits of our solid pre-flop play to win the maximum. And take a note of what I've put here in the bottom right corner of this presentation. This is a question you should be asking yourself almost any time you bet after the flop and hold'em. If the answer to both these questions, will better hands fold, will worse hands call, is no, then betting is probably the wrong action to take. If you follow the hand chart properly, you should have the lead, aka aggression, in the hand the majority of the time. So this is a situation we will cover first. So we've raised and been called by one or two players and the flop comes down. Our goal is to end the hand almost always and win what's in the middle. To do this, we must bet. So the question becomes, when should we bet? And we're going to introduce the continuation bet, which at low limits is probably the most powerful tool a player will have in his arsenal. In no limit hold'em, we will miss the flop 2/3 of the time and hit only 1 out of 3 flops approximately. Since we have the lead from before the flop and we've raised and our opponent's only called, we pretty much own this pot unless our opponent has hit something. If they didn't hit, they have to fear that we hit the flop, so they will fold a ton of their hands. And all we have to do to accomplish this is make a bet. So doing the same calculations as we did with the stealing blinds lesson, we can see the minimum success rate required to show an instant profit when continuation betting in different sizes. So if we continuation bet for 1/2 the size of the pot, we only need to win 1 out of 3 pots to break even. If we continuation bet 3/4 the size of the pot, which is what I would typically advocate for bet sizing on the flop for beginners, we need to win 1 out of 2.33 to break even. And finally, if we c-bet the full pot, we got to win 1 out of 2. But as you can see, even when we bet the full size of the pot, we only need to win 50% of the time, and 67% of the time our opponents miss. So if they only call when they have something, we will always be making money on our continuation bets, almost no matter how big we decide to make them. And of course, we're going to be continuation betting when we have a good hand, since we want to build the pot. And by betting whether we hit or miss the flop, as long as we have the right board and know our opponent's tendencies well, we can keep them guessing and on their toes while making bets that show positive expectation, regardless of our actual holdings. Now we will go on to playing the flop. It's just a brief mention: when working post-flop, to make our decisions properly, we must compare our perceived hand range, so what possible hands our opponent thinks we might have, versus our opponent's range of hands, the possible hands we believe them to have. This is a concept that took me years to learn, but it is the heart of the game, and with practice it is definitely learnable. So we want to bet when either our pot equity or our fold equity is high. The first is easy to determine. If we flop top pair, top kicker, a set, a draw, any sort of made hand, we know that we have good pot equity. To determine our fold equity, we must measure the likelihood that our opponent liked the flop. And typically, we would assume, for example, that callers have middling cards or small pairs, but it's not always the case. So if they call a raise, we'd assume they're much more likely to have like 7/8 suited than ace-king. And for the sake of small stakes, no limit, this assumption should be fine. And since our goal is to end the hand rather than show down, this means our opponent's holding is more important than our cards. And thus, for flop play, our fold equity should be the first determinant of our action, with our pot equity coming a close second. So what are good boards to bet? Well, as you can see on the right here, I have dry boards and I have wet boards. If we're going to continuation bet, we typically want to fire at a dry board. The reason we want to fire at a dry board is because there aren't many potential draws on a dry board. So there are fewer hands our opponent can call our continuation bet with comfortably, rather than just calling us with nothing. So good boards to bet would be like ace 10-4, because unless our opponent has an ace, they're probably going to believe we have an ace and fold to our bet. King 7 deuce, again, no real straight draws. Unless they have the flush draw or the king, they're going to have to fold. A board with 2 Broadway cards is great to bet because, as I said, we usually assume that our flat calling opponents have medium or low cards, so they probably won't have a king or a queen, and we can probably take down the pot with a bet. Paired boards are also great to bet because on a regular board, there's 9 ways to connect with the board. You know, one of the 3 kings, one of the 3 other queens, one of the 3 other 4s. On a paired board, there are only 5 cards that could hit. One of the other 2 jacks or one of the other 3 hearts. And finally, I think, although some people would disagree with me, that an all-suited board is a good board to bet if we're in a heads-up pot, because they can pretty much only call us if they have a good card of that suit, and half the time they'll have it and half the time they won't. And since we know that we don't need a 50% success rate to be making money on our C-bets, we can see that those are pretty good odds. Wet boards are the ones we shouldn't bet because they have a lot of potential draws and they're likely to hit our opponents, like 7, 8, 9. That's right in their range. They're straight draws, flush draws, 2 pairs potential, lots they could call us with. 7, 9, jack, again, middling cards, the cards our opponents are likely to have, like a 9, 10's not folding, any jack's not folding, a spade draw, open end straight draw. Lots of potential here. Queen 9, 8 with a draw, same idea. They could already have a straight, they could have a pair and a straight draw, flush draw. 4, 5, 6 is a bad board for us to bet because of all the low cards, very likely to hit our opponent. And finally, I put king, queen, jack, although it is high cards, so it's more likely to hit our range. This board has a ton of straight draws, flush draw potential, and is just really dangerous. You know, even if we have ace, king, we can't be too comfortable putting a lot of action and money in on a board like this. So you want to be aggressive on the dry boards and careful on the wet boards. So what I've just been talking about, the concept of what board to bet, uses board texture, which means what kind of flop we are looking at. If the board is very uncoordinated, meaning there aren't many potential boards, then the board is considered very dry. And like I said, we want to be betting dry boards because there are very few hands our opponent can happily call us with, and if they do call, we can narrow their range of hands very quickly and know what we're up against because there are so few hands that they can be calling with. Like I said, we want to bet these boards almost all the time because our fold equity is very high. It's not very likely our opponent connected with these flops. If we have a strong hand, we want to bet to build the pot so we can win more money and get value for our hand. Again, most of the time our opponents will fold, but if we have a big hand, we just have to hope that they have a decent hand too. And if they don't, whatever, we're fine with winning in a small pot. Also, if we have like no hope, say 6, 7 suited on an ace, king, queen board, we want to bet for 2 reasons. And the first is that our fold equity is high, because we're likely to have hit that board and our opponent isn't, because we're a raiser and they're a caller. So we will often win the pot with a bet. And number 2, if we get raised, we don't give up any pot equity by folding, because if they have a pair and we have 7 high, we have like 1% pot equity. So we don't really care if we have to give up our equity in the pot by folding. We take our shot because we know we're not going to improve, and if we check it down, we're not going to win. So we might as well bet when our hand looks strongest on the flop. Whereas if we had, say, middle pair or even a gut shot, betting and folding to a raise kind of sucks, because at that point we're now giving up 20% equity we have in the pot, and our opponent gains from this. Whereas if we just check behind, we maintain our 20% equity in the pot, and we increase our chance of showing down the hand, which may be the best hand, because it's hard to make pairs. Also, our opponent type changes our plan. If our villain folds to like 90% of continuation bets, board texture doesn't really matter anymore. We should just always bet because our fold equity is so high, and overall we profit from all the small pots we steal versus the one time out of 10 he check raises us and we lose our continuation bet. If on the other hand our villain never folds, well, now we don't bet those hands with zero equity because we know we're going to get called. We only bet for value. Sometimes players will call a bet regardless of the size. Now we might want to bet full pot with our value hands and only half pot with our bluffs. This way we risk less when we're bluffing, but they'll fold the same frequency they would if we bet more. And also when they do call our C-bet when we bet bigger, if we have the goods, we build a bigger pot to win later. The Play in the Player section explains this more in depth, but it's good to start thinking about it early. The more players in the pot against us, the less often we should bluff. If there are more than 2 opponents with you in the hand, I don't really recommend continuation betting as a bluff. I think you should only continuation bet if you are doing so for value if you're against multiple opponents. So now when to not c-bet. Basically, if we're going to be in a tough spot if we get check raised, we don't want to fire the continuation bet. Hands like middle pair good kicker, top pair no kicker, we much rather check behind to control the size of the pot. These hands will often be the best hand, but we don't want to play a big pot with them. Board type is also important. Say we have ace queen on ace-7 deuce. It's fine to continuation bet, because if we get check raised, we can figure our hand is no good. We get our information cheaply and get out early. Unlike queen jack 9 with ace queen on the other hand, our opponent could check raise us with the worst hand and we wouldn't know. In the first example, they'll probably only check raise us with ace king or 2 pair or a set, whereas on the second board they can check raise us with like middle pair and a straight draw, queen king thinking that their gut shot's good and maybe their top pair, some sort of combo draw, I don't know. But we won't really know where we're at with our ace queen. So if your hand can't stand a check raise, don't continuation bet. Whereas if we continuation bet with error and we get check raised, it's an easy fold because we don't really have any claim to the pot anyway. So we took our one chance while our fold equity was high. At least so we thought. It's just the tough decisions we want to avoid. The simple ones, bring them on. Another interesting spot for not betting is if we have a nut draw in a multi-way pot. Whether it's a flush draw or a gut shot, it's been checked to us and we're last to act and everyone thinks we're going to bet because no one else showed strength, so it would be an easy take. Well, if we bet and get check raised because someone was trapping, all the draws are going to fold to the check raise and we might have to fold our draw too if the price isn't right. However, if we take the free card and allow our opponents to make a hand, we can win a big pot. As well, the hands that we're looking to check raise the flop will probably still put money in the pot if the draw we hit wasn't obvious, and also even if the draw comes in because they assume that people with the draw would bet at it. So they just might not give us credit for the hand and we can still win a lot of money. So if you've got a disguised draw in a multi-way pot, it's often correct to just check behind and try to suck everybody in. Lastly, checking behind also has 3 added benefits. Number 1, our opponent must act before us again on the turn. If they check for a second time, we can be pretty sure they're weak and fire a delayed continuation bet, which has the same odds as continuation betting the flop. We just do it on a different street, and now we have more information than we did before, so we can determine our fold equity a little better. Number 2, our opponent might bluff thinking our check meant we had nothing, and we can call down his turn and possibly his river bet without worry because we made sure the pot didn't get too big. Number 3, our opponent won't know what it means when we check, since sometimes we have it and sometimes we don't, so this will make sure that we can put him to tough decisions. Moving on, we now look at playing when we don't have the lead in the hand. In this case, our decisions are pretty straightforward. For low limits, just play fit or fold. If you pick up some equity on the flop, consider playing. If you whiff, then get out. With dry boards, the strategy is pretty simple. If we flop a big hand, we should check, expecting our opponent to continuation bet because it's a good board to bet, and raise when the action comes back to us. Against weak players, we only want to check raise our very strong hands, like top pair, top kicker, or better, because we know they will call with worse. With draws, against a weak player, we should check and call, since we don't expect them to fold, so there's no value in semi-bluffing. And if we have a draw, our hand is probably behind. Against weak players, make your hand, then build the pot. If you don't think you have a winner, try to get out as early and as cheaply as possible. Against strong players, I recommend check raising whenever you have good equity, by which I mean 2 pair or better or a draw. By check raising with draws as well as made hands, our opponent will always be guessing which we have, making life difficult for him. As well, with the draws, we're building the pot, so if we make our hand on a later street, we can win a very big pot. Against good players, we must use our fold equity, and check raising draws as well as made hands maximizes our fold equity along with our pot equity. With wet boards, I advocate a bet out or get out style of play. If we flop a draw or a big hand, or even top pair for that matter on a dangerous board, we want to lead out. Why? Well, if we check to the pre-flop raiser, there's a good chance he'll check behind for fear of getting check raised, because this is not a good board for him to bet. With strong hands, we must build the pot, and missing a street of value is the pits in poker. Also, with a draw, again, we want to build the pot and deceive our opponents so we're not easy to read. And finally, on scary boards, people often don't have enough to continue, so leading out can win you a lot of small pots for very little risk by getting our opponents to simply fold on the flop. But if you don't have equity, don't bet. I've said before, bluffing is the easiest way to waste money, so when you're learning the game, don't try silly bluffs that have no backup plan. Just stick with playing your pot equity. Finally, we have unraised pots. Try to end the pot early in an unraised pot. Bet out if you hit strong, and don't go broke without the nuts. If you're getting action in an unraised pot, you're probably beat. And don't draw to weak draws. In an unraised pot, you will often not be the only person drawing, and unless you are going for the nuts, you should just fold and save your money. You will make your hand, and oftentimes you will lose a huge pot because someone else made a bigger hand. So if you're going to be drawing in an unraised pot, be the guy who's drawing to the nuts, expecting to get paid off, not the sucker drawing to a weak hand. Will better hands fold? Will worse hands call? Even if this is the only statement you take away from this lesson, you'll still have pretty decent post-flop play. And if you took away any more than that, and that's just great. This has been Grips.com for Grips.com, and I hope you enjoyed today's lesson.